Donald Trump's former campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, is on trial today, and it's already moving at lightning speed. The Manafort trial is the first criminal trial in the Mueller investigation. It will offer the public a glimpse at the evidence gathered against Manafort. And as the New York Times reports, it could also create the squeeze on Manafort to cooperate with Mueller on the broader investigation into Russian collusion with the Trump campaign. The Times reports, quote, the subtext, whether Mr. Manafort knew about Russian efforts to influence the election and whether the threat of conviction could lead him to cooperate with the special counsel Robert S. Mueller, weighs not just on the prosecution and defense, but on the White House as well. Among the Americans charged so far by Mr. Mueller's prosecutors, Mr. Manafort not only held the highest position in Mr. Trump's campaign, but he also arguably has the deepest connections to Russia-aligned politicians and political forces. We should point out that the Manafort trial commences on the very same day that Donald Trump is changing his tune on the question of Russian collusion, breaking with his near daily refrain of no collusion to the message first trotted out by allies that collusion in and of itself is not a crime. And at this hour in the Manafort trial, opening statements are underway days ahead of schedule. Here to talk about that, NBC's Ken Delaney, and outside the courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia, former U.S. Attorney and FBI official Chuck Rosenberg, now an MSNBC contributor. Here with us on set, White House reporter for the AP of Helsinki fame, Jonathan Lemire, Matt Miller, a former chief spokesman at the Justice Department, and MSNBC political analyst Elise Jordan. Ken Delaney, take us through the day's events. I understand you've caught some snippets of the opening statements, and really detail for me, for our viewers, how the pressure is bearing down on Paul Manafort to do as the New York Times describes, maybe get squeezed and become someone who could be more useful to Robert Mueller.
It really is, Nicole. As I left the courtroom just now, or the overflow room, the defense was deep into its opening statement. The prosecution had finished their opening statement. And look, this is a dry case about tax evasion and bank fraud. But hanging over it is this enormous pressure that you can almost feel on Paul Manafort. He must be spending millions of dollars on this case. He's got a team of expensive defense lawyers. He's wearing a suit in court, but we know that he's going to sleep tonight in the Alexandria jail in a prison green jumpsuit, and he's facing 10 years in prison in this case, another 15 in another case in D.C. The case just looks overwhelming. I mean, the government said that they had 24 witnesses and 100 documents, and they essentially portrayed a story of greed and lies. They essentially say that Paul Manafort, reaped some $60 million for his work for this Ukrainian oligarch, had it paid through foreign bank accounts so that he could avoid $15 million in taxes. And then when the spigot turned off in 2014, when Viktor Yanukovych, his patron, fled to Russia, he started milking banks, allegedly, the government says, committing bank fraud and continue to commit tax fraud. Now, what was interesting to me was what was the defense going to say, because it doesn't seem like they have much to say. But the defense is hanging its hat on trying to impugn Rick Gates, who is Manafort's right-hand man and turned state's evidence against him, is cooperating and will testify against him. And they're essentially trying to portray him as a star witness who cut a deal to save his own skin. The interesting thing about that, Nicole, is that there already was a massive indictment filed against Manafort and Gates before Gates flipped. So the government's position was we didn't need Rick Gates to make this case against Paul Manafort, and they're saying this case doesn't rest on any one particular witness. Manafort's defense lawyer also tried to argue that if there was tax evasion, it wasn't willful. He didn't mean to sign a false tax return, and that's going to be a key issue in this trial, Nicole.
Chuck Rosenberg, I'm old enough to remember when a political scandal was something that included tax fraud, bank fraud, and immense greed, but I guess times have changed with the Donald Trump presidency. Can you take us through your analysis that whether Robert Mueller's investigators and prosecutors are ultimately able to convict Paul Manafort or not, they will still be able to compel testimony from him?
I think that's right. Now, look, it's always easier, Nicole, when somebody pleads guilty and cooperates, as Rick Gates did. But even if Mr. Manafort is convicted at trial, and I fully expect he will be, by the way, it is, as Ken said, a very, very strong case. If he's convicted at trial, they can compel him to testify against others. They can immunize him, meaning they could strip away his Fifth Amendment privilege after conviction. Believe it or not, they could even do it after an acquittal. So the government has a number of paths open to it to compel Manafort to testify if he doesn't change his mind and plead guilty and cooperate. At this point, with opening statements being delivered in federal court in Alexandria, it seems like he's going the long route. and will not cooperate, but there are options available to the government.
And Matt Miller, one of the things that's been beaten out of me in the time of Trump is my faith in coincidences and serendipity. Donald Trump trotting out a new line on the question of collusion, that it is in and of itself not a crime. Do you think it's a coincidence that the Manafort trial is underway, that the Cohen tapes have been seized, that they include recordings, that Cohen is talking about whether or not Donald Trump might have had some knowledge of that Trump Tower meeting, which we know is at the center of Robert Mueller's obstruction of justice investigation and the collusion questions?
No, I don't think it's a coincidence at all. I don't think it's just about Paul Manafort, but I think there are now two potential witnesses in play against the president. One is in New York, Michael Cohen, who could cooperate against him in both the Southern District of New York investigation and the Robert Mueller investigation. We've seen leaks about what he might have to say there. And the other is Paul Manafort. At this point, it seems like Paul Manafort has chosen the other path. He's really, for a long time, had two ways out of what is the likely outcome if he doesn't cooperate, which is spending the rest of his life in jail. One way is to cooperate with prosecutors and get a reduced sentence. The other is to wait and hold out and not testify. And even if the snare that Chuck laid out comes to fruition, where he's convicted and later is compelled by a subpoena to testify, just to be held in contempt and hold out to the last dying moment because he's waiting for a pardon from Donald Trump. I think that's the scenario. That's the strategy he's pursuing right now.
But even if he gets a pardon, doesn't he still have to share everything he knows? Doesn't he still have to cooperate with the investigations?
If he were pulled into a grand jury, subpoenaed and ordered to testify and given immunity where he couldn't exercise the Fifth Amendment, he would have to. But I think there's always a difference between a witness who comes in and wants to cooperate because they know there's some value in their cooperation in terms of a reduced sentence, and a witness who comes in and conveniently just can't remember what happened.
So the difference between like a Mike Flynn, whose son was also embroiled, and he's going to be more helpful because he's waiting for something on the back end?
Yeah, that's right.
Elise Jordan, I want to remind everyone just how highly Donald Trump Jr. thought of Paul Manafort around the time at the convention when the Republican platform was changed.
There's a reason Paul's in the position that he is today, and Corey's not, and it's not because Paul's amateur hour. It has nothing to do with that. I think it's nonsense. I've heard that other people asked, oh, is the family on the outs with Paul? Total nonsense. You know, we couldn't be more happy with the work that he's doing, the way he's tackling these things, the way he's handling the organization of everything going forward. He's done a phenomenal job. I wish we had him on earlier.
I wish we had him on earlier, and just, you know, Robert Mueller's interest in the relationship between Donald Trump and Paul Manafort. These are from the questions that were published earlier this year. Robert Mueller wants to know what knowledge the president had of any outreach by his campaign, including by Paul Manafort, to Russia about potential assistance to the campaign.
I think that you can't overstate the importance that Paul Manafort had in securing the Republican nomination for Donald Trump. You've got to remember that at the time when Paul Manafort entered the campaign, Donald Trump had just lost in Wisconsin, and his shaky operation had no organizational apparatus where they were going to actually secure the delegates that were needed so that he would actually get the nomination and not have a contested convention. And actually, Paul Manafort did quite a good job of quelling the uprising, too.
It's a good point, because at the time, Ted Cruz was still alive, and there were talks about collusion between the Cruz campaign and the Kasich campaign to deny him of those delegates. I want to just bring this back to this big Russia question. I mean, it's again not a coincidence that Paul Manafort was on the dole for Russians. He wasn't working for people in the Middle East. It always comes back to Russians. And here's Jeremy Bash on our program. At the time they said this, he blew my mind, but it seems more possible today that Jeremy was onto something.
It's possible that Russia actually sent and dispatched Paul Manafort to the Trump campaign, or at least that once Paul Manafort attached himself to the Trump campaign, the Russians said, okay, our agent is now on the inside, and that they tried to manipulate the campaign, not just through propaganda, not just through Russia Today, but also through agents of influence.
So when he said that, I was watching Homeland, and I thought, oh, my God, this is like the Useful Idiot episode with the, of course, Republican senator. But what do you make of the possibility? It certainly seems possible.
I mean, at this point, it would be hard to rule anything out.
Right.
I mean, Manafort's links to Russia are so deep and have been for so long, and there's certainly lots of dark corners and shadows in that story. And, you know, remember, he worked for free for Donald Trump.
Nothing is for free.
Nothing is for free. And that, you know, we know that there's been reporting that he owed quite a bit of money to some people back overseas. It is certainly, as pointed out in the beginning of the block here, Russia's not on trial here, but Russia is shrouding this whole thing. And it is, I think we all agree, there's no such thing as a coincidence right now. And there's been a steady drumbeat this last few days. It started with Giuliani, and now we see the president today talking about collusion is not a crime. But that has been their argument throughout, that there is no collusion, no collusion, no collusion. And of course, the crime is conspiracy, where that's been sort of well established. But yet, that's not the argument they're making now. This is, again, they're not fighting in the legal sense. They're fighting in public relations. And they are obviously concerned. I mean, there's so much news every day. It's easy to lose track of just who Paul Manafort was. I mean, the John Jr. clip is illuminating. I mean, he ran the convention. He did, as you said, he beat back a real effort to steal the nomination from Trump in Cleveland. That we remember being on the floor and people were fascinated where that was going to go at the time. And he ran this campaign, and yes, it was only for a few months, but his role here can't be overstated, and he is now on trial just a few miles from the White House.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.